Couple minutes here, we'll get started, guys. I got a technology team, my chief technology officer.
We wear a lot of hats around here.
Lots of icons on that desktop. Very, very makes you nervous looking at all of them. 2 minutes, guys, and we'll get started.
One Mississippi, two Mississippi.
Have at it, brother. Good. This is just your name, email, phone number if you don't mind. If you don't want to give us that, that's fine too.
I don't need that to say it. And I didn't, but so it should be like, what about it's like that? So I mean, it's already not.
All right, guys, we'll get the show on the road. Thank you for being here tonight.
Hey, Rich, can you tell if your volume is on? Make sure you're on.
Can you hear me on there?
No.
I don't know why I wouldn't be. I mean, the volume's up. Let's see here.
There we are.
Okay. So if you're out there in Facebook land, we have our chief. We hired a new chief technology officer here at Favor Greenville, Lisa Mincy, and so she's manning the Facebook Live. And if you have any questions, you can send it in, and she will ask the question during the group or try to answer the question the best she can. But we will take questions from the cyber world, or whatever we want to call that.
The cloud.
The cloud. Thank you very much. So tonight, guys, we're going to go through and we're going to talk about, I'll go over really quickly some basic stuff. Please ask questions if you need more information about any particular topic. It's very difficult to cover every single area that we need to cover. There's a lot of different information regarding substance use disorders, a lot of different issues regarding addiction. Stop me and ask me clarifying questions, because I'm going to go over the basic stuff in a pretty at a pretty high level tonight, because I want to get into how do we make these difficult decisions, and how do we handle circumstances when we have to pick between two bad choices. We all know what to do whenever it's kind of, hey, this is the obvious answer on what we should do. This is the best thing for my loved one. This is the best place to go with this problem. That's cool if it's black and white, but many times it's not black and white. You feel like you're choosing between the lesser of two evils, right? So I want to talk about that tonight. I want to talk about how to have those difficult conversations that go along with it. A little bit about me real quick. This is who I am professionally. I've been doing this type of work for about 20 years. I'm also a person in long-term recovery. For me, it was opioid use disorder. Way before opioids, though, it was alcohol. And so I came into opioids via a car accident, if you will. And I don't blame a doctor for my substance use disorder, although it was very easy to get a hold of these things in 1999. But I walked out of the emergency room with 120 Darvocet. And I got to tell you, like, those things grabbed a hold of me in a way that's very, very hard to explain. I knew my way around the party. You know, it wasn't like I was innocent, but I'm telling you, it was next level in terms of physical dependence and psychological craving. I go to bed every night saying, I'm not going to do that tomorrow. I'm done. I wake up, first thing I can think of is, where am I going to get that today? And then an intervention gets done and things, you know what happens from there. Just to give everybody a heads up, if you ever go in your house and your family is all sitting in a circle and there's a stranger there, that is not really grandma's birthday party. Just agree with everything they say and do whatever they tell you to do, right? And I've been here at Favor Greenville for 6 years. Over 6 years we've been up and running here. If you haven't been to this group before, the purpose of this group is to provide education, information, answer questions. What are you doing?
We got a few of the crowd.
Oh, okay. See, my chief technology officer is already paying dividends. She changed the angle of the camera. Okay. So if you haven't been here before, tonight is it's meant for families. And if you're in recovery, you're more than welcome to be here. But if you share, make sure you share from the perspective of trying to help the family. This isn't a recovery group in the classic sense for those of us who are in recovery. This is meant to provide family information. And if you go down the route and I cut you off, don't take it personally. It's just I really want to stay focused on what family members need to hear. We have other groups every day at noon. We have a group called All Recovery. That is for people who are in recovery or seeking recovery. Also Tuesday and Thursday evenings at 6:30. Then we have a lot of other groups that we host, but we don't run. AA, NA, Smart Recovery, Celebrate Recovery, all those type of things. So check out the calendar when we're done here today too. All right. So we'll just start with the basics. We'll just go through why do people do what they do? Family members who are dealing with this, you're going through these circumstances. There are clear consequences for behavior. There are clear consequences if Rich continues to get high. There are clear consequences if I continue to drink and drive. But I keep doing them, and they don't make sense to anybody, right? This is the fundamental issue with substance use disorder. It doesn't make sense. There's nothing rational about the behavior. And I know that it gets a little bit controversial because people say, well, Rich, you chose to do it to yourself. You chose to take these substances. And to a certain degree, I get that, right? I mean, I understand that I put this in my body, but it's very hard. You'd be hard pressed to find any disease or any disorder that didn't have something to do with the person's choices, with their behaviors, what they put in their body. The best example is type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes you're born with. Type 2, you give it to yourself based on your behavior. Literally, you're told to don't put that in your body, and you keep putting it in your body. And over time, your pancreas stops producing insulin, and you suffer the consequences for that. So to me, there's a parallel between that type of lifestyle, chronic disease, and substance use. The difference is if you're dealing with type 2 diabetes, you're not doing the crazy stuff that we're doing whenever we're using. The reason why people cannot, one of the reasons why people have trouble accepting substance use disorder as a disease or as a disorder and not bad behavior is because there's a bunch of bad behavior involved with it, right? The way you treat your family, the way you treat your coworkers, the fact that you just stole the car, the fact that you stole pills off of somebody, the fact that you're lying to doctors, all that stuff creates this atmosphere where people are really, really angry when they're dealing with somebody with a substance use disorder. It's going to make you mad when somebody looks at you and looks you in the eye and lies to you. No, I didn't do that. Well, I just saw you. I saw you get in my purse and take $50 out. No, I didn't do that. No, and then they'll talk you into believing that they didn't do it. And that's highly aggravating. So I understand why people struggle with it, but it's important for family members to know, if you've been here before, we've talked about this, that you're not dealing with a rational person, and you are not going to simply debate them into a recovery process. You're not going to say something to the person where they all of a sudden they go, oh, I didn't think of that. Okay, I'm going to quit. It's going to require very difficult decisions. And it's going to require some boundaries and some changes in your behavior that eventually, in our opinion, forces the person to change their behavior. Think of it as a system. The family is a system. It's like a baby's mobile. And if you move one part, you move the whole entire system. So, if your loved one isn't making changes, if they're not trying to get better, if they don't want to talk about this and they're quote unquote in denial, the idea would be, what can you change that makes them see this a little bit more? We don't, at Favorite Greenville, we're not big on words like enabling or codependent, and I'm definitely not a fan of the term tough love. But the principles from those slogans are legit, guys. They are. It's this idea of what can the family do different, because you can't control the person. You don't have powers to control their behavior. You cannot make them go to another meeting. You cannot make them go to another rehab. All of that is up to the person. But what can you control? All right. Now let's go through a couple other things. What can you do? We've talked about this every week. We'll go through it real quick tonight. Stop me if you have any questions. If it's dangerous and you're concerned and you're like, it's DEFCON 5 and you have any influence over the person, let me make sure I emphasize that. If you have any contact with the person, if the person's living in your house, or you have some kind of financial leverage, or even if you have emotional connection, you can talk about doing an intervention. How many people, by show of hands, know what an intervention is? How many people have done an intervention on their loved one, by show of hands? Okay, so a lot of you know this already. This is probably the most common step that a family thinks about when they think about how do we help our loved one? What can we do? And we do it different, or we believe differently than what you see on TV. We're not into like the TV interventions. You guys know what I'm talking about? The A&E intervention show. That's a made-for-television reality TV show. It's horrible. I don't even know how they get away with what they get away with, to be honest with you. I think it's a travesty that they follow people around and they exploit people who are in active addiction, exploit their families. But at any rate, we don't do that type of intervention. We believe more in family meetings. We believe more in transparency. We believe in letting the person know that you're thinking about doing an intervention. So one of the deals would be like, we're a favor. We're learning about this. Your loved one's going to say, well, what's that mean? What's that all about? And you would explain, like, we're going to do something. We're thinking about doing an intervention. There's no surprises. Do you guys get that? This isn't about, let me sneak up on the person. The kind that was done on me. Those have been shown to be highly ineffective in terms of the actual follow-up. People go to rehab and they spend 3 weeks being angry at their family about what just happened because they feel like they've been ambushed. We believe you tell the person, we're worried about you. We're not sure what we're going to do about this. We don't know how to handle this exactly, but we're talking, we're over favor, and we're thinking about an intervention. And if we do one, we're going to invite you. And the family always says, well, they won't come. They will come, guys. There's no way when you're in active addiction that you're going to let your whole family get together with an interventionist without you showing up to defend yourself. Very few people will allow that to go down. So they'll be there. That doesn't necessarily mean it'll work, but they typically do show up. What questions about interventions? How can I clear anything up here? Any other thoughts on the intervention part of the process? Interventions are expensive. Favorite Greenville, we don't have the manpower to do interventions. We do the next thing I'm going to talk about, which are family meetings. Interventions, we could refer you to an interventionist. They typically charge. They come in. They teach you about the disease of addiction. You guys already know that, but then they talk you through and they practice and they prep for the actual experience. What questions about this? Yes.
When you say you do family interventions, do you include friends in that?
Yes, typically. You want to have a team. The question was, do you include friends in an intervention? And my answer to that is absolutely. You got to have more than one person. If it's one person, it's not an intervention, it's a conversation, right? If you have two, you're getting a little bit better, but you want to have ideally 5 to 6 people who can be on that team to help confront that behavior that person's displaying. The more people that are there to reinforce that this is a problem, the better, because it's easy for me to explain away. Like if Lisa, if I'm Lisa's loved one and she's confronting me on what's going on, I can explain how she's crazy, right? But then if Lisa's here, so on and so forth, that there's 5 other people, it's harder for me to explain it away. So there's power in numbers. Now, we don't need 20 people. People always say, what's the max? 12 would probably be the max. You might get different opinions from different people. I wouldn't even really be comfortable going up to 12. Ideally, like around 8 would be perfect. Most of the time when I've done interventions, it's been about 4 or 5 people. But friends, I don't know that I can say this across the board, but almost every intervention I've done has involved friends. The question is, who are the people that are intimately acquainted with this person that have some influence over this person. And that's not always the people who you think should have influence over them, especially if they're younger. Think about adolescents. Mom and dad, regardless of how we want it to be, we don't have the most influence over adolescents, right? We're not the most important people in their lives. The most important people are their friends. And I've had situations many times where people who they were using with have been in the intervention. You can do that. And you'll have other, here's a common thing. There'll be another family member who's using. And it'll be like, so-and-so's getting high too, or so-and-so's drinking too much. They can be part of the intervention as long as they're willing to play ball, do the prep work, and participate in the conversation and not show up under the influence. What other questions about this? Well, yes.
I would just add, don't overlook younger children if they're educated.
Yeah.
In the case of my daughter, she got cold feet on going to rehab, and her 9-year-old son said, "Mommy, you have to do this to get better."
Yep.
And she got out of bed and went.
I think 9 years old is fine to be in an intervention. Absolutely. I think they got to be educated and they got to be prepped, and there's got to be somebody there to support them through it. But I think you can have kids in it. I don't know if you want to go below 9. That might be hard. Like a 7-year-old probably doesn't even know what it is and doesn't really know how to say it. But think about what you're trying to do in an intervention. Even think about like doing an intervention the right way. Let's pretend there is no right or wrong way to do an intervention. What's the point? The point is to confront the behavior and let the person know that we can't just stand here and watch you self-destruct and you're killing us. And this is hurting us because the idea is that emotional leverage is just as powerful as financial leverage. If I know how this is destroying my kids and I know how this is affecting my kids and the reality hits me in the face, many times I'll seek help. Anything else related to intervention? Going once, twice. All right. This is something that we can help you facilitate. So here, we would want you to call our hotline number, and we don't call it a hotline anymore. We call it a helpline. In 24 hours, available coaches, they can guide you through the process of trying to get referred and trying to talk to somebody if you want to do an intervention. The thing about an intervention, guys, is it costs money, and it's definitely like the most intense thing that I can tell you about. It's one of those things where families have to be sure that they're ready. You guys get that? One notch below an intervention, we just call these family meetings. And the only difference between an intervention and a family meeting is a family meeting doesn't involve ultimatums. So if I'm doing an intervention and I say, "Hey, Rich, here's the deal. If you don't go to rehab, you have to leave the house. If you don't go to rehab, I can no longer pay for you to be in school. If you don't go to rehab," whatever it might be, fill in the blank. A family meeting is the same idea. We're worried about you. We don't want you self-destruct, but you don't involve ultimatums in it. The point of a family meeting is, have you guys heard the term elephant in a room? We want to get it all out on the table, man. We're not going to like act like this isn't happening. So for example, many times there'll be a relapse involved. People will be like, "My son went to rehab," or "My daughter went to rehab," or "My husband went to rehab." And I think they're using again, but they don't talk about it. And they don't say anything. And it's what happens. You just sort of let it, you're just crossing your fingers and hoping that it's not happening. You're hoping it just goes away so you don't have to deal with it. We would say, sit down, have the meeting, have the conversation. But you don't have to throw the ultimatum on the end. You guys get that part? You can do as many of these as you want. Like, our opinion is you should be talking about this stuff on an ongoing basis. I'm up here saying it like it's easy. It's a very hard topic to bring up. What gets in the way of family meetings regarding this topic?
You don't have any leverage.
Well, you don't have any leverage or you don't have any contact with the person. That'll make it very difficult, right? Maybe they're not living in your house. Maybe you don't have any connection.
Fear, you pick the scab and then you hemorrhage.
Yeah, so there's this idea of, if I bring this up and I pick the scab, who's going to stop the blood after that, right? And the person you're talking to is not the most pleasant person in the world. Agreed?
Amen.
They're not going to be big fans of the idea of bringing this subject up. So a lot of times families you avoid the tough conversation because it's not going to feel good. It's not going to, it could easily be a lot of yelling. It could be a lot of conflict. It could be a person storming off, slamming the door, "Screw you." And then you're worried. You play this scenario out in your mind where you're like, "I'm worried if I say anything, what? They're going to run away. I'll never see them. and it's going to get worse. So those are all the type of things that prevent this from happening. But the idea would be you use your own judgment. You start asking yourself questions. How bad is this? How urgent is this? Is it going to go away? How do I feel? A lot of times family members will say, well, they feel like they're all tore up anyway. So let's get this out. And you don't have to do it in a confrontational manner. I'm going to talk about that as we go through. You can have some strategies that'll make these conversations go better. All right? And then, okay, let's talk about what is substance use disorder, or what is addiction, if you will. So we have to acknowledge right off the jump that not everybody who uses drugs is addicted. Actually, the majority of people who are using drugs and alcohol are not actually addicted, but they could still be using at a risky level. It could still be causing all kinds of problems in their lives. It's still a worthy conversation. But what I'm going to tell you is this group requires a very specific approach when you're trying to deal with them, because if you cross the line into substance use disorder severe or addiction, your brain has changed. There's a fundamental brain shift, and it has to do with a neurotransmitter called dopamine. And if you look at this, the image on the right has to do with the suppression or the depletion of dopamine. And if dopamine is not present, or you're unable to produce dopamine, you'll be caught in this cycle of psychological craving. You'll be caught in this cycle. It's where the substance starts to take on a survival instinct. It starts to take on this process where you start to treat it like, I got to get something to eat. I got to get something to drink. I got to get this to live, because that's the same mechanism that drives us to go back and eat food. Pleasure, dopamine. That was good. Let me get more food. Let me get something to drink. Let me be in a safe environment. Dopamine is released whenever anything pleasurable occurs. So you can see how this gets hijacked when the substances flood your brain and the brain eventually shuts off the production. This is why you can't have a rational conversation with somebody in active substance use disorder. Has anyone here ever tried to have a rational conversation with their loved one when they're actively using? It doesn't go well, does it? Black is white, up is down, 2 + 2 = 18, right? And everything is an argument. You don't know you start to question like your own version of reality to a certain extent. You're like, I think he's using, but he says he isn't. Everything is somebody else's fault. Have you ever experienced this with your loved one? Where every situation, what that is that's their brain literally resorting, they want to protect this idea of the addiction. So it cannot be, I can't take a look at the substances, because if I take a look at the substances, I might have to give up the substances. So I can explain it every other way. It's my wife, it's my mom, it's my job, it's my car, it's the financial markets, it literally, like, it's the economy, it's the stress, it's this, it's that, but it can't be about the substances. Because if I start acknowledging it's about the substances, man, that's scary. Because now the only thing that I've held on to that was in any way giving me any relief, you're going to tell me I'm not allowed to do that anymore. And that's where this idea of, how many people have heard about denial? We've all heard the term denial, right? And again, whether you want to call it that, or you want to call it pre-contemplation, or just lack of awareness, or whatever label you want to put on it, that's where that's coming from. An unwillingness to take a look at your behavior, because your behavior, in your mind, your behavior is what's saving you. So I have no dopamine in my brain. All I'm feeling is miserable. Maybe I'm also dealing with co-occurring depression. Maybe I'm also dealing with trauma. And you're going to tell me I'm not allowed to use this? No. I'm going to tell you whatever you need to hear to convince you that I'm going to continue to use this. I think I've told this story. In the 90s, I was convinced I had mad cow disease in the 90s. It was all over the TV. You eat a bad hamburger. Well, your speech is slurred. You have trouble sleeping. You stumble into walls. Those were all my symptoms. I'd have been okay with mad cow disease. I'm kind of joking, but I'm kind of not joking. Like, that would have been a better diagnosis than substance use disorder. Because over here, I don't have to confront the idea that I'm not going to be doing this stuff anymore. And early on, guys, that's very, very difficult. That's where a lot of the anger comes from. That's where a lot of the acting out comes from. It's scary to think about the fact that I'm not going to do this anymore, especially if you have, a couple different scenarios. If you haven't had any real success stopping, it's very, very, you tell yourself you can never get this. Or the opposite, if you haven't even tried before, right? You don't even know what life's going to be like. The good news is after you start down the road, you realize, okay, this is cool. I can breathe. I'm going to be okay. But how do you get the person to that point becomes part of the problem. And then the good news is you come back online as time goes by, right? As time goes by, your brain comes back online. You become back to normal, back to where you were in this process. So it isn't a permanent condition. Yes, sir.
Richard, this is either an MRI or a CAT scan.
This is a PET scan.
PET scan. Are there any other ways to determine the levels of dopamine other than going through it at this step?
Not that I'm aware of. People, I'm not aware of a blood test or anything like that can get it done. I've only ever heard of scans to get it done. Scans are widely criticized by a lot of people. There's a lot of controversy around this. And one of the main criticisms is if this is like the way it is, why aren't they used more? Like why if your kid went to rehab, did he not get this done? Or why did I not get it done? That doesn't discount the effectiveness of a scan. That speaks more to insurance reimbursement and the system that funds things. This should be done on everybody who goes into any kind of clinical setting. You should they should look at your brain and tell you, here's what's going on with you. It affects everything. And people, this is part of the process of working through the stigma and the stuff that we're really behind the times in terms of the science when it comes to recovery-related things. Now, you could show that to somebody and they would say, I don't care, whatever. That doesn't mean I'm addicted. You could still argue with that. That psychological process is still there. And it's and again, this is also an emerging area that I do think there might be things in the future where we can get better with this.
Some kind of other metric that you could use. To counterbalance.
And try to start to figure out what is going on with the person, what's good. And there's a lot of other factors that feed into this, guys. You got to remember things like co-occurring disorders, co-occurring trauma. Everybody's not the same. Are we clear on that part? I'm telling you this in broad terms, but I don't want to come off like every person in recovery, their experience is exactly the same or what they need is exactly the same. That's not the case at all. I mean, there are people who lean more toward maybe a mental health issue. So picture like having depression, like very serious depression. Can you see how that would change the dynamic on substance use? The reward potential would be completely different than a person who didn't. You have to take into consideration all these issues. That's not your job though, right? That's where mom and dad, you have to become like mom, dad, husband, and wife. You sort of become case managers or experts yourself because you have to help negotiate the system. But at the end of the day, this is stuff that therapists and groups and psychiatrists and things like that need to be helping the person work through. Very difficult. Yes.
Are more places doing the co-occurring stuff?
No, co-occurring disorders really aren't managed the way that they need to be managed. Co-occurring disorders are more like a label. And you'll have like co-occurring disorders where there'll be a psychiatrist on staff, but that doesn't even mean everybody's going to get evaluated. That just means we have our own psychiatrist we can refer you to. So if you have a loved one in treatment and they call it a co-occurring disorder center, I would insist that they get seen by a psychiatrist to the treatment center staff because it's not automatic.
We had a hard time finding one that would even take her knowing she got
A lot of times it'll be like, well, I can't do that until the addiction is stabilized, that kind of stuff. I think that's getting a little bit better as time goes by. So you start to learn what's going on and you start to learn what do we call this and what do we think our loved one's dealing with, and then you start to say, do I want to talk about it? Are we going to talk about this? Are we going to confront this? And again, the scenario, guys, it could be anything. It could be this is our loved one and we're just finding out about substance use disorder, or it could be they relapsed, or it could be we're just worried that they're not doing what they're supposed to do. You get that? It could, any of the above. And do you talk about it or not? And a lot of times people won't go there. And you guys have mentioned this already tonight. It's scary to go there. It's one of those things where it is easier to cross your fingers and just sort of, let's just wait and see what happens. And that is an option. Don't get me wrong. That absolutely is an option. But fear is probably the main driver of avoidance. Agreed? Also, what else goes in that category? Fear, guilt. Maybe you truly don't know, but there's all these different factors that contribute to, we're not going to talk about this. This is classic stuff, guys. Most situations where substance use disorder is present, it just never gets discussed. So it's been widely established, if you will, that 50% of Americans know somebody intimately, a family member, friend dealing with substance use disorder. 1 out of 2 people. There aren't 50% of people in Greenville County here tonight, right? So you guys are ahead of the curve by coming to a group like this. You're actually the exception to the rule. Isn't that fascinating? Most people will not touch this with a 10-foot pole. What else do you think contributes to that? Tell me about anger. Anger.
Going up and, fear that somebody's going to explode is brought up, or I'm so angry I know I'll blow up.
Yeah.
If I pursue it.
A history of this going in a certain direction. So maybe it's better I just don't say anything at all. And I get that for sure. Who else? Yes. Anyone else have any ideas what gets in the way?
But nothing will change,
Nothing will change. What's the use?
even if we have a family meeting.
What do you think? I don't know if you guys could hear that, but the idea of like nothing will change. Why do we want to bother with that? What drives that part of the process? What makes people think nothing will change?
Because we tried to talk, just the 3 of us, and just total denial on her part.
Yeah, so we've been there, done that, but you did try.
Yeah.
So I do think that this nothing will change drives it. I think it drives it because of that, Carolyn. But I also think we have ideas on how this is going to go because we've had experiences with other people in our lives, and we predict what's going to go on with our loved one based on what went on with our dad, or based what went on with our brother. You get where I'm coming from? My dad drank himself to death and never did anything about it. He went to rehab 7 times and it never got any better. Why would I even bother? That unspoken stuff drives a lot of people's opinions around substance use disorder. And I believe that's one of the main reasons why people don't come to groups like this. They had horrible experiences in their childhood, or they had horrible experiences in other scenarios. So they literally tell themselves, groups suck and they don't work and they're full of crap and they're never going to do anything. So why would I bother? Were you going to say something?
It's lack of knowledge.
Lack of awareness, lack of knowledge. Yep.
Awareness that, what we were told worked before, which didn't work. What else do you have to go on unless you know about this new information?
And I
You don't
think,
know it.
and I think to that end around telling yourself whether it works or not, maybe this is something we should camp out at for a minute. So this idea of, did it work? How do you define whether or not it worked? First of all, what is it? What do we mean by it?
Family meeting.
So you're talking family recovery. How do we know it worked or not?
Well, it did work.
How do we know whether it's successful or not?
Communication.
Results,
If you're getting communication.
The results with what?
the behavior that they're displaying, whether it.
The person you care about. Okay, this is good stuff. This is good conversation. Because what I fear is that is what is driving you. Because that's what drove me. If I come to family group, my person will get better. And that's where you want to challenge yourself and step back. Because that is not how you should judge success for this group or for yourself. You should judge success for yourself is your head doesn't quite feel like it's going to explode today the way it did yesterday.
I sleep.
Or I slept. I'm sleeping a little bit more. Do you see it? Now, for the person in recovery, when I'm going to recovery group, I'm judging. It's very clear what I'm judging. I'm judging whether or not I'm getting it right. I think it's real important for family members not to set themselves up for a broken heart by thinking this is it. We got this. All we got to do is do this intervention. And if we do this intervention on Lisa's going to go to rehab and we're good to go. You get that? Because, guys, recovery is a journey. Even in the best of circumstances, recovery is a journey. It's a process. It's like any other change. You're 1 step forward, 2 steps back, 5 steps forward, 1 step back. That doesn't mean anybody's guaranteed to relapse. That's not what I'm saying, but you get the general idea. How many of you have tried to change something before and you don't have to raise your hand, you don't have to make eye contact, I know, but I'm sure you've actually tried to change things where it took multiple tries. And that was probably something that didn't involve this neurobiological process that addiction does. If going to the gym or changing the way you eat is difficult, or changing the time you get up during the day, or whatever it may be, whatever other habit you've struggled with. Imagine how hard it is if you're dealing with this, where your ability to even think clearly is compromised. And I'm not making excuses for anybody. I'm telling you this for your own expectations and your own process. So what does that mean? That means that as you approach this, you stay committed to groups like this, or you stay committed to therapy, or you stay committed to whatever it is that keeps you sane. Church, exercise, yoga, essential oils, if you're into that stuff, huffing candles. Like, I don't understand any of that, by the way. I'm not sure what's therapeutic about sniffing a candle, but whatever. And like, what are they? Different flavored candles, cinnamon toast crunch candles and stuff like that. They're always some kind of cool name. You go through that and you stick to your path, and you stick to your, I don't want to say this, you stick to your own personal boundaries and your family's boundaries around how you're going to handle your loved one. And the idea is that you're going to be okay no matter what's going on with them. So there's so many times when I'll see somebody, or I'll talk to somebody here at the center, family that I know from group or what have you, and I'll be like, how's it going? And they won't tell me how they're doing. They'll tell me what's going on with their loved one. An explanation as to, he's doing great. But I didn't ask how he was doing. I asked, how are you doing? And it's this idea of like, I'm okay if he's okay. I'm not okay if he's not okay. That's what you got to watch out for. That's the essence of this family process. And the good news is that people who stay engaged in recovery get better. I don't know if we've talked about this in here, but the results are pretty positive for people who keep, quote unquote, coming back. Now, understand, this means coming back to anything. It doesn't mean any certain group. It doesn't mean coming to Favor. It doesn't mean going to AA. It doesn't mean going to any certain group. It means if you keep trying, you tend to get better. And that makes all kinds of sense, right? I mean, that passes the common sense test big time. But remember, when you're dealing with this, you're dealing with somebody who's coming at it from a deficit, if you will.
So when you have this family meeting, and if they're in active use, is it going to do any good?
So I think that's a great question. Like, the question was, okay, I want to have a family meeting. I'm worried about my loved one. He or she they're using, and it's clear they're using. We all know they're using. Should we have a family meeting if they're actively using? So you can't have a family meeting if they're literally actively using that day. If you do have a family meeting, well, first of all, you can do an intervention anytime, because an intervention comes with ultimatums. Are we clear on that? Like, an intervention is, hey, it's hitting the fan today, Rich. We don't really care how you feel about this. We're telling you what we're doing. You guys get that? A family meeting is different. There is no ultimatum. So the question would be, I think you got to know your loved one, to be perfectly honest with you, and you have to say to yourself, like, will they even hear me? Or you have to try to control it to a certain degree where they will, hear you. And remember, there's a difference between the person if they're actively like in the deep end part of their addiction versus early on in like a relapse. Your brain is not going to get here. Your brain is not going to get here the first time you use. This takes a little bit of time. So the idea would be get in there as soon as possible. Yes, ma'am.
So how do you so you're saying you can't have an ultimatum without an actual intervention?
Oh, no. I'm saying that's what an intervention has to have an ultimatum. I'm not saying you can't.
You can bring up ultimatums.
Absolutely.
Prior to.
Absolutely. So great question. So you can use ultimatums, or we would use the word boundaries or expectations. You can do that anytime. You don't have to even have a family meeting to have those type of conversations. I'm not going to put up with this. If you come back to the house and you were under the influence, you can't come in the house. Things like that. Absolutely. The point I was trying to make is you can't do an intervention unless you have ultimatums, that kind of thing. Do you guys get that? Make sure we clear that up. That's a fantastic question. You can absolutely set your own boundaries or ultimatums at any point in time in the relationship, and you should be thinking about that. But interventions are interesting. They tend to come up when people kind of know what's going on and the behavior is kind of escalating, right? And a lot of times it even escalates slowly. And the family says, well, we're going to do this now because we want to try to get the person into rehab or something. And there's certain people in the family who have been doing boundaries and certain people who aren't. Have you ever experienced that? So it's like my wife is doing boundaries, but my mom isn't. Or my dad is doing boundaries and my mom isn't. You see how, and then the intervention circles everybody up and we all say, what are we all going to speak with one voice today? And that's the difference between some of those conversations. What other questions about this part of the process? This is just a super cool little PowerPoint thing that I did here. Look at that, man. It's like borderline art. Tough crowd here tonight. So what this is meant to illustrate is all the stuff that is in your mind that will keep you from doing what you want to do in any given situation, from having the difficult conversation. And it's hard to see, but you start to worry about the person. They're not attending meetings. I'm making up a scenario. This person was in rehab. They were doing great for a while, but all of a sudden red flags start to pop up and you're thinking, I got to say something. They're not going to meetings. They go out at night. They're not responding to texts. You stand up, you stay up all night, pacing the floor until they come in. Then this is the big part. This is exactly what they used to do. The history is repeating itself. Have you guys ever experienced that?
Yes, sir.
And your spidey senses are going off. Like, this isn't cool, but you don't say anything because you have all this baggage. And this baggage, it's totally understandable, guys, why you would avoid the conversation. It's totally understandable why I avoid the conversation. It's not going to be pleasant. It's not going to feel good. Your brain is telling you it's not going to feel good because it's literally like, hey, that is exactly what happened last time. Do we really want to go there? Maybe it's not going to be like that. Let's not worry about it just yet. And sometimes you're right. Sometimes it's not going to be like that. But the deal is, how do we get to a point? And this is where, when you start thinking about talking to somebody when they're not in active addiction, right? When their brain is back online, to Carolyn's point, I feel like one of the things, that everybody in recovery needs to understand is it is okay for family members to ask questions about this. I'm going to tell you a couple things right now. I'm going to tell you some facts. If a person refuses to take a drug test, it's because they've been getting high. Nobody in the history of recovery has refused a drug test if they were clean. We want to pee in every cup everywhere. Okay? And also, if we're doing the right thing, we want to tell you about it. You get that? If I'm going to meetings and I'm seeing my therapist and I'm not hanging around with people who are using, it's cool. I want you to ask questions. If they're resistant to asking questions, it's because they're off the path. So now you got to step back and say, well, what would make them resistant to talking about this if they're off the path? They perceive that if they're off the path, what's going to happen? The hammer's going to drop. So really part of the conversation is, or part of the planning on the parents' part, on the spouse's part and everything like, is what are we going to do and how do we approach it if they're off the path? And what are our expectations? Do we take the car away if they're off the path? Do we automatically send them back to rehab if they're off the path? You get where I'm coming from? You have to think it through. It starts to become this like probation officer, vibe between loved ones. Like, I can't let them catch me. I can't let them, and that is not going to get it done. So the conversations have to be done in a way where it's very difficult. It's like, well, if you find out they're using, are you supposed to just ignore that? Is that what you're saying, Rich? And I can't sit here and tell you that's exactly what I'm saying, but what I'm telling you is that the more you're talking about this and the more you're communicating with this and the more you're trying to find a way to like work with the person to get them back on the path, that's better. But it's very, very difficult. It's very difficult. And it's you have to have a certain mindset when you go into the conversation. You were talking about being angry. If you go into the conversation too angry, it's just going to turn into a blow up. If you go, you have to figure out where are we at in this process. People have said, so I've shared this before, when I'm going through what I was going through, man, I mean, I'm out of the box. It's like, trying to scoop these pills everywhere I can. I didn't know how to buy them from the street. I was hopelessly addicted to opioids. And this is in 99. You really didn't buy these things from the street. And you just got them from doctors. You just bounced. But you'd still run out and then things would happen. I remember I would drink on top of this and get in a car accident or do whatever or not come in. My wife and I got in this crisis state where it would just be crisis, leave, come back, crisis, leave, come back. And then I'm telling you, at one point in time, she said, if you do it again, well, no, she said, you're out, you can't come back. And I knew I couldn't come back. And to this day, I'm convinced that if I go get drunk, I'm going to get kicked out, right? So I go to my wife, like I'll go out tonight after this and have 5 or 6 beers and go home and say, oh, it's just a disease, Melissa. I'm sure she's going to kill me in my sleep if I do that, right? So I'm up here acting like as if this is an easy thing to give these people like and have this like conversation, but it's not. And there is no right or wrong answer. You have to know where you're at with it. She was at a point where what? I'm just done with this. You may be like that too as a family member. How do you know whether you're there or not? How do you know whether you're done? Anybody willing to share how you know when you're done?
When they got violent.
Violence, physical aggression.
They would.
If you're under threat, for sure. If they're stealing your property, typically that kind of stuff. If there's but what if that's not what's going on? What if it's just that like they're using it in my house and I don't know if I should okay this? That takes longer to get to a point when you're done. You'll feel like exhausted from the experience. You will feel like I can't take any more of this. You'll feel like you're gonna die. And that's whenever you want to honor your own feelings in that regard. You guys get that part? It's okay for you to put yourself first and say, I can't do this anymore because I can't sleep at night. You can't live here anymore because I just literally can't even deal with it. Like every time you leave the house, all I do is pace the floors all night. So get out. Yes.
You can be done more than once.
And you can be done more than once. Absolutely. And you can be done and then be undone. And you have to, the other thing is you don't want to grade yourself on this. You guys get that part? There's no right or wrong way to do this family recovery thing. And there's no like, well, you were setting boundaries for an hour, for a while, but now you're a miserable enabler. I've had people come in and say to me, I'm the world's worst enabler. And then they're like shoulder shrug. I'm like, don't say that about yourself. This is not enabling behavior. I don't even think it is enabling behavior. I guess at the end it enables a behavior, but it's a trauma response because somebody you love, you think they're going to die, so you rescue them because that's what you do from a trauma point of view, and your brain makes you automatically do it. It doesn't mean it's healthy. It still needs to change. Do you get where I'm coming from? Because I used to use drugs to deal with trauma. That needed to change too. People rescue to deal with trauma. You guys get this? It's literally the same process. I bet you if we scanned your brain, it would be a similar deal. I bet you whenever you're in the middle of a crisis with your loved one and you go rescue me, as soon as you jump in the car to go toward their apartment to find out what's going on, if we were scanning your brain, you get a hit of dopamine. You at the very least would see relief. And that is highly addictive when you're walking around all day, completely twisted up like a knot, and all of a sudden you go and you get them and you help them and the relief is there. It's not enabling. It's not because there's something wrong with you that you're like some kind of I can't stand the fact that they paint family members like that. Like you're like a weak-willed person who's just going to let people run all over you. That is not what's going on. And if you approach it like it's that, then that's highly problematic because that'll get you to what? Swing the pendulum the other way. And you'll start doing things just because you think you have to do it. And if you talk to people, you start the sentence with, if that was my kid, I would. Or if that was my husband, I would. Or if that was my daughter, I would. You just immediately, you hang up the phone. You don't listen to those folks. They don't know what they're talking about. And also, they wouldn't do it if it was their kid. There'd be a reason not to. I've said this before. It'd be like, well, my kid's left-handed. Their kid was right-handed. We all know left-handed people can't make it on the street. That was a joke, guys. Tough crowd tonight. All right. So yes, sir.
We know a lot about you. You got essentially two families, early and later.
Yeah, with the same mom, the same wife. Let's clarify that. I do not have two families going on. So yes.
Sorry about that.
Yes.
You don't have to answer this. You don't want to.
Yep.
How old were your kids when you were going through all this?
So my son was 9. My daughter was, no, my son was 8. My daughter was 6, and my other daughter was 3.
The older kids.
Yeah, the older group. And then they lived through that craziness, and I'm certain that it had impact on them, but they've all kind of, we've been very open about that and worked through that, and they're all doing fine now. Been some bumps in the road, believe me. And then we went through what we went through and got back together and reconciled. And my goodness, we reconciled because we had 4 more kids. We reconciled too often, apparently. So you know, those kids have no idea. The second group of kids have no idea what that was all about. We talk about it, and we talk about it mostly from a point of view of there's a genetic vulnerability around substance use and stuff like that. And they know that I run favor, and they know, you know, why I run favor to a certain degree. But my older kids are, I mean, they remember incidents. They remember, you know, things that went on. They remember the arguing. They remember it's highly impactful in family members. And I grew up in a house like that, and I remember it to this day. And what I can tell you, though, is the most important part of that process is talking about it. When you don't acknowledge that it's there, what you do is you send another message to the person. And so, like, it's one thing you're going through it. It's another thing. It's not even important enough to talk about. You must be out of your mind to even make a big deal about this. But when you talk about it, you talk about the monster, right? And you say, this is what it is. This is what it's called. This is why it happened. It starts to lose. It's still not fun, guys, but it starts to lose some of its power. The deal is, though, that the conversation takes on many, many different forms, guys. And there's a journey to this. Like the conversation you have early on with your loved one when you first find out they're dealing with this is completely different than the conversation you have after they've been through treatment and they know what they're dealing with and you know what you're dealing with. You're going to have 2 different sets of feelings about that. One of the things that happens if your loved one is just getting into treatment, everybody's optimistic and you're kind of like, you give them a break because they didn't know what they were dealing with. But whenever they reject it, when they come out and they reject it, you're going to be more angry about it. You're going to start saying to yourself, you know exactly what you're doing. You guys, and so you have to understand, take a look at the details of your personal situation in any given period of time and really, really, you know, be honest with yourself on what you're able to do. And do not think that there's a cookie cutter approach to this. Do not think that there's a right or wrong approach. So this is the terminology. So when you're dealing with like, what's the term? When you're dealing with the lesser of 2 evils, two choices, neither one is good. It's called a Morton's fork. Now you know, if you're ever on Jeopardy, you will know the name of this. Like Alex Trebek. What is a Morton's fork? So here's what it is. So you have 2 choices in any given situation, and both the choices suck. And that, to me, captures the essence of making decisions on what you want to do with your loved one. Anything you do is going to be uncomfortable. Even if you do nothing, it's going to be uncomfortable. Because you're here, and if you came here, it's because things aren't going real well. So no matter what you do, there's going to be some level of discomfort to it. And the idea is, how do you start to choose, and have you ever felt like you were living like in the middle, or you were paralyzed, or you couldn't make a move, or you just couldn't take a step, and I don't know what to do with this, and you feel like you're just totally overwhelmed? And people will talk about being numb, like they can't make any decisions. So everything becomes overwhelming where this issue is concerned. And if you look, so you have somebody, I just made up situations, guys. This could be anything, but situation, loved one, they're at home. Maybe they came out of rehab. It's escalating. You just now are getting to the point you just know that this isn't going well, and you know that you need to do something. What should we do? And you can put anything in these boxes, right? This says over here. I said we can do nothing. We just continue to ignore it, or we can confront it and kick them out. Those are extremes, right? There's neither one of those are good, and you could list the negatives for each one of those. If you don't do anything, you're still living with the circumstances. And you probably he's probably not going to change if the situation stays status quo. If you kick them out because they continue to use, now you're up all night wondering where they are and what they're doing. And you're saying to yourself, we should let them back in because at least I know where they're down. And the idea is you have to be gentle with yourself as you negotiate that. And you start asking yourself, is there a third way? Is it when you feel like you have these 2 extreme options, you start to ask yourself, is there any other way to do this in between? So this idea of we're going to do nothing, or we're going to, make you get help or get out. Those are extreme. What would be a third way? A third way would be we're going to start talking about what other boundaries we can set. maybe it isn't that we're going to kick you out, but we're going to take the car, or we're going to take the phone, or we're going to quit paying for the phone, or we're going to quit paying for the car, or we're just going to start to detach from this, and we're not going to emotionally validate what you're up to. The idea would be, if you can't, you start to work on what you can work on, and you understand that that's just as positive as the more extreme example, if you will. One of the things that you're doing by being here is that you're starting to live in the solution, and you're choosing that third way. You guys get that? You're here, and we always recommend that you let your loved one know that you're here, and you let them know that you're listening. You tell them to check out the Facebook page and see what I'm saying. There's no secrets here. Substance use disorder is destroying your life. Me talking to your loved one now. It's destroying your life. It is. I'm not saying you're going to die today of this, but keep it up. I mean, it's not going to end well, guys. And your family's here because they care. How is that a bad thing? Now, go ahead.
She said, haven't you learned enough?
So haven't you learned enough? Why would a person in substance use disorder not want their family to come to this group? Anybody have any theories?
They don't want them to find out any possible solution. That
They don't.
want
Yes, it's almost subconscious whenever you're using. You just want the status quo to continue. You don't want any new information coming in. You don't want that coming into the system. You want to try to be able to what? Alienate your family, separate your family, isolate your family, tell them stories about how this is normal, tell them stories about how this is no big deal. Now, there's a couple other things about this that's unique to the Favor Greenville approach. And again, as I say this, I'm not telling anybody what to do with any situation. I'm simply telling you that the way that we think of it is, we don't think of it quite such black and white terms, where Rich is either going to get help and start to go to rehab and go to 90 meetings in 90 days, or you're just going to monitor it and let it go. We also see, like, people can start coming to Favor Greenville even if they don't want to quit. People can start talking to a therapist even if they don't want to quit. People can start working on their own type of recovery. You guys get this? We believe in multiple pathways to recovery in the most sincere manner possible. That 46% of people who find recovery figure it out on their own. Now, they don't really figure it out on their own. They just don't identify like a specific path. What you find is they wind up talking to people who know something about it, and they start to put things together. So I don't know if you've ever known anybody who used like exercise as a recovery pathway. That would be one of the best examples of this. They almost become obsessive about exercising. They buy into this idea of a healthy lifestyle. They reject this idea of a recovery lifestyle. They don't want to be identified that way, but they buy into this idea of a healthy lifestyle. I'll give you another example. Many times people will start with a mental health counselor. It's very interesting, especially if they have a genuine co-occurring disorder. So you could probably find something in my background where it would say that I had depression. Because as I was going to these doctors, I was saying whatever I needed to say. I would always walk out with a handful of prescriptions, but I really only wanted the opioids, right? But there would always be something else along with it. Sleep problems, because I would go in and I would say I can't sleep at night. And I'm sure I was diagnosed with depression, but I didn't have genuine depression. So I was coming into this, I needed to recover from the substances. Some people are coming in with real depression, right? And real anxiety and real trauma. Many times it's interesting, they'll start their pathway through a mental health counselor. So what we say is start something. Start something. Start somewhere. Come to a Favor meeting. Go back to your therapist who you were seeing for a while. Go back, to maybe get involved in a different type of recovery program at church. I don't care how you do it. Let's just start doing something. Now, what's interesting is you have to put that through your own template, because if they're abusing you at home, verbally or physically threatening or stealing your stuff, you get where I'm coming from. You don't want to be like, hey, go do whatever. The particulars of your circumstance, and also if you know for sure they're doing certain things that are really, really dangerous, then you may have to resort to let's get you into a rehab, right? The one thing about rehab for sure is it's behavioral containment. You will go there and you won't leave, and nobody will be in, and we're going to make sure you're not using. Doesn't anyone on Facebook have any questions, Lisa?
Well, I just had one come in.
I just want you to say, stop. I want you to be like, Gerald from Wichita wants to know. If you have one like that, I want to do one.
All right,
Okay, but if
all
you
right.
don't, I don't really
I
care.
don't have one.
Okay, if
right
they're all
now.
local people, if they're local people, I'm not answering it because they need to be here. So you start to really widen your view on how this thing works and what the person can do in order to be working and walking down that path. You don't say it has to be a certain thing. This is just suggestions. You say, like, what are you going to do to get this done? What are you going to do to start doing this, Rich? What's your plan? What's your pathway? And then you listen, and it's reasonable. You kind of, as you set your boundaries, you start to take that into consideration. I want to emphasize one more time that counselor thing. I've been thinking about this because I was thinking about my past experiences before I came to Favor, and so for a long time, I was doing a lot of different things. I was running rehabs and stuff, but I had a very vibrant private practice, and people would come see me. It's so interesting, for mental health issues, and clearly the substance use was just as much. But if the family talked to them about coming to see me about substance use, they wouldn't come. If they flipped the script and talked about mental health, they would come, which goes back to what? That original thing that I talked about, where we're going to subconsciously protect the addiction. So I could be dealing with depression and alcohol, but I'm not going to really want to talk about the alcohol. I'm going to talk about the depression. I shouldn't say most, any good therapist can talk about both. And you can start from talking about depression and move into alcohol. You guys see how it'd be very natural. How do you deal with that? Well, I drink a case of beer a night. Well, tell me more about that, right? And that's different than maybe what you've been told. You got to be careful. You're not thinking like there's one way to get this done, and I got to get Carolyn into a rehab, and if we don't get her into a rehab, it's not going to work. Anything outside of the family where they start talking about substance use, preferably with experts, right? Preferably with somebody who knows their way around it. What other comments about the third way or about pathways or any other ideas that anybody else has used in order to right the ship or get the person back on path? What's interesting in my life is, the battery's running dead. See, no matter what, you better go get a cord, because if this thing goes off, every week this thing goes off. Hurry up, Lisa, run. Don't panic out there in Facebook land. The battery's going dead. We're going to figure it out.
Maybe that's why it's been going down.
So so I'm 19 years of recovery, been here for about 7 years. So I guess it's 12 years into recovery this happened. And I haven't had a fixed thought or an obsession to use any substance probably since maybe about 90 days into my recovery. I'm totally serious. I'm never going to use drugs or alcohol again.